In the heart of an ancient forest, a lone Apache warrior thrived on solitude. But when the moon rises full, even the deepest wilderness can't hide horrors whispered only in legend. Well, before we start the video, I want to ask you to like the video and leave a comment. This helps the channel a lot so that we can continue to bring many videos every day. The sun, a nascent orange disk, had only just begun to paint the jagged eastern peaks, when Taza was already a whisper in the undergrowth. His bare feet, calloused and knowing, made less sound on the carpet of fallen pine needles and damp earth than the scurrying of a field mouse. Each step was a meditation, a conscious placement learned over countless dawns spent melding with the forest that was both his larder and his temple. His breath, a slow, steady rhythm, barely misted in the cool morning air that still clung to the shadows beneath the towering ponderosa pines and ancient oaks. Taza's world was one of subtle signs. The flick of a deer's ear 100 paces distant, the nervous chatter of a squirrel heralding an unseen presence, the faint indentation in the mud that spoke of a passing coyote hours before. Today, his focus was singular. The buck, a fine, mature specimen with a rack of antlers like a thorny crown, had left clear tracks leading from the stream where it had drunk at first light. Taza had picked up the trail effortlessly, his dark eyes scanning not just the ground, but the air itself, feeling for the slight shift in the breeze that might carry his scent prematurely to his quarry. He carried only what he needed, a sturdy bow crafted from seasoned juniper wood, its string a tightly wound sinew, and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers, their obsidian tips gleaming dully in the filtered light. A keen-edged knife, its handle worn smooth by his grip, was tucked into a sheath at his hip. His lean, muscled frame, clad in simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, moved with an inherent grace, a testament to a life lived in constant motion, attuned to the primal rhythms of survival. For hours he tracked, a patient shadow. The forest unfolded around him, a symphony of rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the sigh of wind through the high branches. He passed through groves of aspen, their leaves shimmering gold in the strengthening light, and across small gurgling streams, their waters cold and clear. He noted the busy work of a beaver damming a nearby creek, the swoop of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, the fresh scat of a black bear, all pieces of the intricate tapestry he was part of. This was not merely a hunting ground. It was his home, his kin, the very breath of his spirit. He understood its language, its moods, its unwritten laws. Solitude here was not loneliness, but a profound, unbroken connection. His wickiup, his small domed dwelling, was nestled discreetly in a sheltered hollow several valleys away, woven from sturdy branches and covered with layers of bark and animal hides. It was a simple structure offering protection from the elements, but his true home was the vast expanse of these mountains and forests, a territory his people, the NDE, the Apache, had roamed for generations beyond counting. He was a solitary guardian of this particular stretch, a choice made years ago, after the great sickness had thinned his band, and a personal grief had led him to seek solace not in the company of others, but in the deep, quiet wisdom of the wild. The sun climbed higher, now a warm presence on his bare shoulders. The buck's trail led him upward onto a sparsely wooded ridge where the scent of pine was sharp and clean. Taza slowed his pace even further, his senses stretched taut. He saw it then, a flicker of brown against the dappled green, the almost imperceptible movement of an ear. The buck was browsing peacefully, unaware. Taza sank lower, becoming part of a low-lying juniper bush. He moved with the glacial slowness of a stalking cat, closing the distance one careful inch at a time. His heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against his ribs. This was the culmination, the sacred dance between hunter and hunted. He nocked an arrow, the familiar feel of the shaft and string a comfort. He drew, his muscles coiling smoothly, holding his breath. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. He aimed for the heart, a quick, clean end. Just as his fingers were about to release the string, a sound, alien and discordant, fractured the morning's serenity. It was distant, yet it carried clearly through the crisp air. A low, guttural growl that wasn't the challenge of a bear, nor the warning of a wolf. It was something else, something that made the fine hairs on Taza's arms prickle despite the sun's warmth. The buck's head snapped up, its large ears swiveling, nostrils flaring. The moment was broken. With a flick of its white tail, the deer bounded away, vanishing into the trees with astonishing speed. Taza slowly lowered his bow, the arrow still nocked. He let out his breath, not in frustration at the lost prey, but with a new, subtle tension coiling in his gut. He scanned the direction from which the sound had come. His eyes narrowed. The forest was a master of deception, its sounds often misdirecting. But this felt different. He couldn't place it. Perhaps a cougar with a throat ailment, or two bears squabbling over a carcass hidden from his view. Such things happened. He stood for a long moment, listening, his head tilted. Only the familiar sounds of the forest answered, the sigh of the wind, the chirp of a distant bird. The unsettling growl did not repeat. With a slight shrug, Taza unstrung his arrow and returned it to the quiver. The buck was gone. There would be other hunts, but as he turned to make his way back towards the lower valleys, a sliver of unease, thin as a pine needle, had pricked the edge of his usually undisturbed peace. The forest, his constant companion, suddenly held a note of unfamiliarity, a whisper of something he did not yet understand. The encounter was brief, almost forgettable, yet it lingered, a faint dissonance in the otherwise perfect harmony of his solitary world. He would remain watchful, his senses already sharpening, preparing for the day's continued unfolding, though now tinged with a subtle, almost imperceptible question mark. Several days passed. The sun rose and set, painting the sky in hues of fire and lavender, and Taza moved through his routines with the same measured grace. He successfully hunted a young doe, its meat providing sustenance, its hide destined for mending his moccasins or adding another layer to his wickiup against the coming cooler nights. He gathered late-season berries, their tart sweetness a welcome addition to his diet, and checked his snares, finding a fat rabbit in one, a plump grouse in another. The strange guttural sound he'd heard on the ridge faded from the forefront of his mind, relegated to the category of unexplained but ultimately insignificant forest noises. His world, for a time, returned to its familiar rhythm, the vast silence of the wilderness broken only by the natural chorus of its inhabitants. Yet the forest had a way of holding on to secrets, of revealing them in its own time. It was on a morning crisp, with the hint of autumn, when the leaves of the aspens were beginning to turn a vibrant gold, that Taza found the first undeniable sign that something was amiss. He was walking a familiar game trail, one used by deer and elk, moving between a mineral lick and a reliable stream. The path was well worn, the earth usually packed firm, but today a section of it was churned as if by a struggle, and there, pressed deeply into a patch of damp soil where a small spring seeped, was a track. Taza knelt, his dark eyes narrowed, studying it intently. It was huge, far larger than the paw print of any wolf he had ever encountered, larger even than the print of a male black bear. The shape was canine, with clear claw marks extending beyond the pad, but the proportions were wrong. The spread of the toes, the depth of the impression suggesting immense weight, the sheer predatory size of it. It sent a shiver of disquiet through him. He pressed his own hand beside it. The track dwarfed his outstretched fingers. He had seen the tracks of many creatures in his life, from the delicate etching of a fox to the heavy tread of a bull elk. But this was alien. This did not belong. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the surrounding undergrowth. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual chirping of unseen birds seemed muted, the rustle of squirrels absent. He followed the trail a little further, finding more of the strange tracks, some overlaid, indicating the creature had passed more than once, or that there were more than one, a thought that brought a fresh wave of unease. Then he found it, the remains of a young buck, not unlike the one he had pursued days earlier. It was not the work of a clean predator. The carcass was not neatly consumed, but savagely ripped, bones splintered, flesh torn in great, ragged chunks. A cougar killed with a bite to the neck. A bear might break bones and eat messily. Wolves would tear and share. But this was a frenzy of unparalleled violence. The ground around it was torn up, bushes flattened, as if a terrible, brutal struggle had taken place. Taza felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not hunger. This was rage, a destructive force unleashed. He circled the kill site, his senses on high alert. There was no scent of bear or cougar, only the coppery smell of blood and a faint musky odor he couldn't quite place. Something wild and rank. He backed away slowly, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his hip. The peace of his solitary world had been definitively shattered. This was no mere anomaly. It was a tangible threat, an unknown entity capable of such ferocious destruction. He spent the rest of the day with a heightened sense of alertness. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that danced at the periphery of his vision, seemed to hold a potential menace. The familiar sounds of the forest now carried an undercurrent of something sinister. He reinforced the entrance to his wickiup that evening, piling heavier stones around its base, ensuring his spear was close at hand as he prepared his meager meal. Sleep did not come easily. The image of the massive tracks and the ravaged deer played over in his mind. The following morning, he decided to make a wider circuit around his territory, his purpose shifting from hunting for sustenance to hunting for information. He needed to understand what manner of creature now shared these woods with him. He moved with even greater caution than usual, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears straining for any unusual sound. It was near midday, as he was carefully navigating a dense thicket of manzanita close to the stream that fed his small hidden spring, that his heart seemed to stop. There, pressed into the soft earth not 20 paces from the entrance to his own wickiup, was another of those enormous clawed tracks. It was fresh, the edges still sharp, water slowly seeping into its deep indentations. Taza froze, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air tracing its way down his spine. The creature had been here. It had been close, so close to his dwelling, perhaps while he slept, perhaps while he was away. It had scouted his camp. The silence of the forest suddenly felt heavy, suffocating, like the stillness before a violent storm. Whatever this thing was, it was not just a random wanderer. It was aware of him, and it was near. The fine line between hunter and potential hunted had just become terrifyingly thin. The discovery of the track so near his wickiup coiled a knot of cold dread in Taza's stomach. It was one thing to find signs of a strange beast in the wider forest, another entirely to realize it had approached his sanctuary, his small island of relative safety. He spent long moments studying the print, committing every detail to memory. The splay of the powerful toes, the deep gouges left by claws that seemed unnaturally long and sharp. This was no ordinary animal. The musky, rank scent he'd detected at the deerkill site, though faint, seemed to linger here too, a ghostly signature of its passage. From that moment, Taza's awareness shifted. The forest, once a familiar embrace, now felt laced with unseen eyes. He moved with a heightened caution that bordered on paranoia, his senses stretched to their utmost limit. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every rustle of leaves carried a potential threat. He found himself constantly scanning the tree line, the dense undergrowth, the hidden hollows where danger might lurk. His sleep became lighter, broken by the snap of a distant twig or the mournful hoot of an owl, sounds that previously would have soothed him, but now served only to sharpen his unease. He did not abandon his routines entirely. Survival demanded he continue to hunt, to gather, to prepare for the lean months of winter. But every action was now tinged with a new vigilance. When he left his wickiup, he would circle it first, searching for fresh signs, his spear always in hand. When he returned, he approached with the stealth of a stalker, ensuring nothing lay in wait. One evening, as the sun bled crimson through the western pines, casting long, dancing shadows, he noticed it. A small pile of firewood he had meticulously stacked beside his wickiup was subtly disturbed. A few logs were out of place, not enough to be obvious, but enough for his keen eye to register the change. Had he been careless? Unlikely. He lived by precision. He circled the area, finding no tracks, no obvious sign of intrusion, yet the feeling of being observed, of his space being invaded, intensified. Another day, a snare he had set for rabbits along a well-used run was sprung. The pliable sapling bent and snapped with a force far exceeding that of any small game. The bait was gone, but whatever had taken it had done so with a brutal efficiency, leaving no trace but the splintered wood. It was as if the creature was toying with him, or perhaps testing his defenses, learning his habits. The nights were the worst. Huddled by his small fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness, Taza found himself listening with an almost painful intensity. The familiar night sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the canopy, were now punctuated by periods of unnerving silence, as if all of nature held its breath. On one such night, clear and cold, With a sliver of moon hanging in the inky sky, he heard it. The distinct, sharp snap of a dry twig breaking just beyond the ring of firelight. He froze, his hand instinctively tightening on the shaft of his spear. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom, but saw nothing but the shifting shapes of bushes and trees. He sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, every muscle taut, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was no further sound, no movement. Was it merely a deer, startled by his fire? Or was it the creature watching him, assessing him? He could not be sure, and the uncertainty was a torment. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was indeed a large, unusually cunning cougar, one that had learned to be wary of humans. Or a solitary displaced bear, bolder than most. He clung to these explanations for the alternative that he was being stalked by something unknown, something monstrous, was a thought that chilled him to the bone. He was a man of the natural world, a world he understood. This felt outside of that understanding, a dark intrusion into the known order. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and grey, he was returning to his wickiup from a fruitless hunt. He had chosen a slightly different path, moving along a ridgetop that offered a wider view of the valley below. The air was still, the forest settling into the quietude of twilight. And then he saw it. Not clearly, not for more than a heartbeat, but it was enough. Far below, near the edge of a dense stand of pines where the shadows lay thickest, a massive dark shape detached itself from the deeper blackness. It moved with an incredible, almost liquid speed, not the lumbering gait of a bear, nor the bounding leap of a deer. It was low to the ground, yet powerful, disappearing into the trees before Taza could truly focus on its form. But in that fleeting glimpse, he registered its sheer size, its unnatural swiftness, and a chilling sense of purpose in its movement. He stood rooted to the spot, the breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to categorize what he had witnessed. It was too big, too fast, too wrong. The last vestiges of his attempts to rationalize the strange occurrences crumbled. This was no ordinary animal. This was the source of the tracks, the cause of the ravaged deer, the unseen watcher that had been haunting his steps. And it was real. The forest around him suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper, the familiar landscape transformed into a place of potential, lurking horror. The game of cat and mouse had just taken a terrifyingly tangible turn. He was no longer just uneasy. He was afraid. The fleeting, nightmarish glimpse of the creature from the ridgetop solidified Taza's fear into a cold, hard certainty. Sleep that night was all but impossible. He sat with his back against the most solid part of his wickiup, his spear across his lap, the small fire burning higher than usual, casting flickering, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with imagined threats. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tightening net. He knew he could not stay huddled in his camp indefinitely. Survival dictated movement, action. But the question was, what action? How did one hunt a shadow? How did one defend against a force that seemed to defy the natural order he knew so intimately? The answer, or at least a more terrifying piece of the puzzle, came with the dawn of the next day, or rather, in the deepest hour just before it. Taza, dozing fitfully, was jolted fully awake by a sound that ripped through the pre-dawn stillness. It was a howl, but unlike any he had ever heard. It was not the mournful cry of a wolf pack, nor the territorial call of a lone coyote. This was a sound born of raw, primal ferocity, a guttural, blood-chilling roar that seemed to vibrate in the very air, echoing through the valleys and silencing every other living thing. The small birds that usually began their chorus with the first hint of light remained deathly quiet. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Tarza's heart hammered against his ribs. The sound was closer this time, much closer, perhaps from the next ridge over, or even the valley below his camp. It was filled with a terrifying power, a promise of violence that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He clutched his spear, his knuckles white, every fibre of his being screaming danger. When the first grey light of dawn finally seeped through the trees, painting the world in monochrome, Tarza cautiously emerged from his wickiup. The air was cold and heavy, still seeming to carry the echo of that terrible howl. He decided to fortify his shelter further, gathering heavier stones, weaving stronger branches into its frame. He worked with a grim determination, the image of that fleeting monstrous shape, and the memory of its howl fueling his efforts. Later that morning, driven by a grim necessity to check his snares and assess the ongoing threat, he ventured out. He moved with extreme caution, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. He gave the area where he had glimpsed the creature a wide berth, instead heading towards a series of snares he had set along a deer trail further down the valley. As he approached the area, a foul, overpowering scent assaulted his nostrils. The same rank, musky odour he had detected near the ravaged deer and faintly near his wickiup. But now it was overwhelmingly strong, mixed with the coppery tang of fresh blood. His stomach churned. He slowed his pace, his spear held ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. Then he saw them. Scattered across a small clearing, amidst flattened bushes and blood-soaked earth, lay the bodies of several wolves, not one or two, but what looked like the remnants of a small pack. They were animals he recognized, creatures of strength and cunning in their own right, the apex predators of this forest alongside the bear and cougar. Now, they were nothing but mangled heaps of fur and bone. Their throats were ripped out, limbs torn from sockets, their bodies bearing the marks of an unimaginable savagery. It was a scene of utter devastation, a clear and brutal message of dominance. Tarza felt a wave of nausea, quickly suppressed. This was not a territorial dispute between wolf packs. This was a slaughter, executed with terrifying efficiency and power. He knelt cautiously near one of the fallen wolves, its once bright eyes now dull and staring. Around it in the bloodied earth were those same massive clawed footprints. And then, snagged on a low-hanging branch of a thorny mesquite bush nearby, he saw it clearly for the first time. A tuft of coarse, dark fur. It was stiff, almost bristle-like, the colour of charcoal and dried blood. It was fur unlike any animal he knew, unlike bear, unlike wolf, unlike cougar. He reached out a hesitant finger, touching it. It felt alien, wrong. As he straightened, his gaze fell upon a single perfect track pressed into a patch of damp clay beneath the bush. It was deeper, clearer than any he had seen before, as if the creature had paused there, perhaps surveying its brutal handiwork. The sheer size of it, the lethal promise in the deep impressions of its claws, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through Tarza. This was a monster, a killer of killers, and it was staking its claim on his forest, on his world, with a violence that was both terrifying and deeply personal. The scent of fear was no longer just a feeling within him. It was a palpable presence in the air, a suffocating miasma emanating from the carnage at his feet. Tarzan backed away from the gruesome scene of the slaughtered wolves, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The rank, musky scent of the killer, mingled with the iron tang of blood, clung to the air, a suffocating reminder of the brutal power he now faced. He made his way back to his wickiup, not with his usual fluid grace, but with a heavy, deliberate tread, his mind reeling. The forest, his lifelong companion, felt alien and hostile, its familiar paths now fraught with an unseen monstrous threat. He spent the remainder of the day within the relative safety of his small dwelling, the entrance barricaded more securely than ever before. The image of the mangled wolves, the sight of that coarse dark fur, the imprint of that enormous clawed track, these things played over and over in his thoughts. He tried to piece together what he knew, what he had seen. This was no creature born of the natural world he understood. Its strength, its ferocity, its very presence spoke of something other. As the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet, Tarzan found his mind drifting back to his childhood. He remembered evenings spent around the communal fire of his band, the air filled with the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke. He remembered the elders, their faces lined with the wisdom of generations, telling stories. Stories of the creation, of the trickster coyote, of brave warriors and powerful spirits. And among those tales, half forgotten, dismissed by his younger self as mere fables to frighten children, were whispers of darker things. He recalled hushed words about shapeshifters, beings who could walk as men by day and transform into monstrous beasts under the cloak of night. Tales of skinwalkers, of men who, through dark rituals or curses, gained the ability to take on the forms of animals, often wolves or coyotes, imbued with unnatural strength and a malevolent hunger. He remembered descriptions of creatures that were not quite wolf, not quite man, but something terrifyingly in between, their eyes burning with an unnatural light, their howls echoing with a sound that could curdle the blood. At the time, he had listened with a child's thrill, never truly believing such things could exist beyond the realm of story. His world was one of tangible reality, of the deer he hunted, the storms he weathered, the solid earth beneath his feet. But now, confronted with the undeniable evidence of a creature that defied all natural explanation, those old tales surfaced with a chilling new relevance. Could it be? Could one of those nightmare beings from the fireside stories have stepped out of myth and into his forest? The thought was deeply unsettling, yet it also offered a sliver of, not hope, perhaps, but understanding. If this creature was indeed something from those old tales, then perhaps the tales also held clues to its nature, its weaknesses, how it might be fought. He rose and began to rummage through his meager possessions. He selected his strongest bow, the one made from a particularly resilient piece of mountain mahogany. He carefully inspected each of his arrows, choosing those with the sharpest, most perfectly shaped obsidian tips. Obsidian, he knew, was valued not just for its cutting edge, but some believed it held a spiritual power, a connection to the fire within the earth. He laid out his long, keen-edged hunting spear, its fire-hardened tip a formidable weapon. But were these tools, designed for hunting deer and elk, enough to face a monster from the old tales? A creeping doubt settled in. He thought of the herbs and roots his grandmother, a woman wise in the ways of healing and protection, used to gather. Some were for mending wounds, others for warding off ill fortune, and a few, she had whispered, held power against things that walked in darkness. He had paid little attention then, more interested in the practical skills of the hunt. Now he strained to remember those half-forgotten lessons. He recalled a particular bitter root, one she had said was anathema to creatures of the night, and a certain type of sacred red ochre, ground into powder and mixed with bear grease, used in protective ceremonies. Could these things offer any real defense against such a physical, brutal threat? He didn't know, but he was no longer willing to dismiss any possibility. As the moon, now a few days past full, but still bright enough to cast long, eerie shadows, began its ascent, Taza made a decision. He would gather what he could, prepare as best he knew, drawing on both his practical skills as a hunter and the faint, flickering embers of ancestral knowledge. He would not cower in his wiki-up. He was, indeed, a warrior, even in his solitude. This was his land, his home, and he would defend it. But first, he needed water. His small water skin was nearly empty. His usual spring, a clear cold seep nestled among ferns and mossy rocks, was a short walk from his camp. As he cautiously approached it in the fading light, spear in hand, that rank, musky scent, the very signature of the beast, assaulted his nostrils again, stronger than before. He froze, his eyes darting around. And then he saw it. The spring, his clean, life-giving water source, was fouled. The clear water was muddied, churned up, and a large dark smear of something that looked like mud and blood stained the rocks at its edge. The creature had been here. It had deliberately contaminated his water. This was no longer just a series of random encounters or territorial markings. This was a direct, calculated act. It was a challenge. The beast knew he relied on this spring. It was telling him in the most primal way possible that this forest was no longer his alone. It was staking its claim, not just on the territory, but on Taza's very survival. The whispers of old tales now screamed a terrifying reality in his mind. The deliberate fouling of his spring was a profound violation, an act that went beyond mere animalistic behavior. It was a calculated move, a clear message. Taza stared at the defiled water source, a cold fury mixing with the ever-present fear. This creature was not just a mindless beast, it possessed a cunning, a malevolent intelligence that made it all the more terrifying. He would have to find another water source, further away, more exposed. The creature was systematically trying to hem him in, to break his spirit. He spent a restless day, his mind racing, formulating plans only to discard them. How could he fight something that seemed to anticipate his needs, his movements? He gathered what herbs he could find that his grandmother had spoken of. The bitter root, though he found only a small quantity, and some pungent leaves said to repel unwelcome spirits. He sharpened his obsidian arrowheads until they gleamed, his spear tip until it felt like an extension of his own will. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the creature would come for him. The full moon had passed, but the nights were still bright, the lunar glow bathing the forest in an ethereal silvery light. Such nights, the old tales whispered, were when these beings were strongest. As dusk began to settle on the third night after discovering the slaughtered wolves, Taza made his stand. He did not wait in his wickiup. Instead, he chose a small defensible clearing a short distance away, a place where a tangle of fallen logs and thick boulders offered some cover, but also clear lines of sight. He built a small, carefully controlled fire, more for its psychological comfort and its potential as a weapon than for warmth. He positioned himself with his back to a large, flat-faced boulder, his spear planted firmly in the earth beside him, his bow strung and an arrow nocked. He waited. The forest grew quiet. The usual nocturnal symphony hushed, as if holding its breath. The moon, a few days past its peak but still a brilliant disk, climbed high, its cold light filtering through the pine canopy, painting the clearing in stark contrasts of silver and black. Hours passed. Taza remained motionless, a statue carved from the deepening shadows, his senses stretched to their breaking point. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a thunderclap in the profound silence. Then he felt it, a subtle shift in the air, a prickling on his skin, the same oppressive feeling he'd experienced before, but intensified. The rank, musky odor, faint at first, began to grow stronger, carried on a barely perceptible breeze. His grip tightened on his bow. A low growl, like the distant rumble of an earthquake, vibrated through the ground. It was closer this time, much closer than the howl that had shattered the pre-dawn silence days before. Taza scanned the tree line, his eyes straining to pierce the moon-dappled darkness. A massive, dark shape detached itself from the inky blackness beneath a stand of dense firs. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, not the gait of any known animal. As it stepped into a patch of moonlight, Taza's breath caught in his throat. It was worse than anything the old tales had described, worse than his fleeting glimpses had allowed him to comprehend. It stood on two powerful, digitigrade legs, its body thick with muscle and matted dark fur, like the tuft he had found. Its head was wolf-like, but monstrously oversized, with a long snout filled with rows of gleaming, dagger-like teeth. Its eyes, reflecting the moonlight, glowed with a feral, malevolent intelligence. A chilling, reddish hue. Long-clawed arms, disproportionately powerful, hung at its sides, the claws themselves like obsidian daggers. This was the werewolf, the skinwalker, the nightmare made flesh. It let out another growl, a sound that seemed to rip from its very core, and took a step towards him, its glowing eyes fixed on Taza. For a heartbeat, pure, unadulterated terror threatened to paralyze him. This was not a beast of the natural world. This was an abomination. But then, the warrior spirit, the Ende resilience forged through generations of survival, surged through him. He would not die cowering. As the creature began to lope towards him, its unnatural speed terrifying, Taza raised his bow. He aimed for the center of its chest, a target he hoped would prove vital. He released the arrow. The obsidian tip struck true, embedding itself deep in the creature's shoulder with a sickening thud. The werewolf let out a deafening roar of pain and rage, staggering for a moment. But it did not fall. It barely seemed to slow. It ripped the arrow shaft from its flesh with a snarl, dark blood welling from the wound, and charged again, its eyes burning with an even greater fury. Taza barely had time to drop his bow and seize his spear. The creature was on him in an instant. A whirlwind of fur and claws and snapping teeth. He thrust the spear forward, aiming for its throat. But the werewolf, with astonishing agility, swatted the spear aside with one massive forearm, the force of the blow nearly tearing it from Tarza's grasp. Claws raked across Tarza's left arm, searing pain lancing through him. He cried out, stumbling back, but managed to keep his feet. The creature lunged again, its hot, fetid breath washing over him. He ducked under a sweeping claw that would have torn his head from his shoulders, and in that desperate moment he drove the butt of his spear into the creature's exposed side. It was not a killing blow, but it was enough to make the werewolf grunt in pain and momentarily recoil. That brief respite was all Tarza needed. He scrambled away, putting a few precious feet between himself and the monster. The werewolf, now bleeding from the arrow wound and the blow to its side, seemed even more enraged. It gathered itself, its glowing eyes promising a swift and brutal end. It let out a chilling howl, a sound that seemed to mock Tarza's defiance. Then, unexpectedly, it paused. It looked at Tarza, then glanced back into the darkness from which it had come, as if hearing something Tarza could not. With a final lingering snarl that promised a return, it turned and melted back into the shadows, its massive form disappearing with the same unnatural speed it had shown earlier. Tarza stood panting, his arm throbbing, blood dripping from his fingers onto the pine needles. He was alive, but shaken to his very core. He had faced the beast. He had wounded it, and he had survived. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, this was not over. The werewolf had retreated, but it was not defeated. The moon's hungry eye had witnessed their first true battle, and it was merely a prelude. The fight for his survival, for the sanctity of his forest, had truly begun. The werewolf's abrupt retreat left Tarza standing in the moonlit clearing, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, his breath ragged, the searing pain in his arm a stark reminder of the encounter. He listened intently, but the forest had fallen into a profound, almost unnerving silence. The creature was gone, for now. He quickly attended to his wound, tearing a strip from his breechcloth to bind the deep bleeding gashes left by the werewolf's claws. The pain was intense, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't stay here. This spot was now known, compromised. He had to move, to think, to plan. The brief, brutal confrontation had taught him much. The creature was incredibly strong, terrifyingly fast and resilient. His obsidian-tipped arrow had wounded it, yes, but it had fought on with barely diminished fury. His spear, too, had found its mark, but the beast was far from slain. With the first hint of dawn painting the eastern sky, Tarza gathered his meager belongings. He knew he couldn't return to his wickiup. It was too vulnerable, too obvious. He needed a new, more defensible position, but more importantly, he needed to understand his enemy. He had survived the first attack, but passive defense would eventually fail. He had to take the initiative, however risky that might be. He had to become the hunter again, but this was a prey unlike any he had ever stalked. The blood trail left by the wounded werewolf was easy enough to follow, even for a novice tracker. Dark viscous droplets stained the pine needles and leaves, leading away from the clearing and deeper into the shadowed forest. Tarza followed, not with the direct pursuit of a typical hunt, but with extreme caution, moving from cover to cover, his senses stretched taut, every nerve ending alive to the slightest sound or movement. He was not trying to catch the beast, not yet. He was trying to learn. Where did it go when wounded? Did it have a lair? What were its patterns? The trail led him through dense thickets and across rocky outcrops, always deeper into the wilder, less-travelled parts of the forest. The creature, despite its wound, moved with considerable speed and power, crashing through undergrowth where Taza had to pick his way carefully. He noted the areas it favoured, the paths it took. There was a grim intelligence to its movements, a sense of purpose that belied a mere wounded animal seeking refuge. As the sun climbed higher, Taza began to formulate a plan, a desperate gambit. He couldn't overpower the creature in a direct confrontation. He had learned that much, but perhaps he could outwit it, use his intimate knowledge of the forest, his skills as a trapper, to his advantage. He began to set a series of snares and deadfalls, not the kind designed to catch rabbits or even deer, but larger, more robust traps, intended not necessarily to kill or capture the werewolf. He doubted anything he could quickly construct would hold it for long, but to harass it, to slow it down, to test its reactions, and perhaps to learn more about its vulnerabilities. He chose locations carefully, narrow game trails, the edges of clearings it seemed to favor, places where its path might be channeled. He used his knife to sharpen stakes, his knowledge of knots to create powerful nooses, his understanding of balance and leverage to rig heavy logs that might fall if triggered. It was dangerous, painstaking work. Each trap set was a risk, for he was venturing into territory the creature clearly considered its own. He worked with a silent intensity, his wounded arm throbbing, the constant fear a cold knot in his belly. Yet there was also a grim satisfaction in the work, a sense of agency replacing the helplessness he had felt. He was no longer just reacting. He was actively engaging the enemy, albeit indirectly. He would set a trap, then retreat to a hidden vantage point, watching and waiting for hours. The first few traps remained untouched. The forest held its breath, the silence often broken only by the whisper of the wind or the distant call of a jay. Doubt began to creep in. Was the creature too cunning? Had it moved on? Or was it simply aware of his efforts, watching him perhaps from some unseen vantage point? Then, late one afternoon, as he watched a narrow ravine where he had constructed a particularly heavy deadfall, he saw movement, not the werewolf itself, but the subtle disturbance of bushes, a faint sound of displaced rocks. He held his breath. There was a sudden sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by an enraged guttural roar that echoed through the ravine, the same terrifying sound he had heard before. Taza didn't wait to see the creature. He melted back into the undergrowth, his heart pounding. The trap had been sprung. He had provoked a reaction. He had learned something. The creature, for all its power, could be surprised, could be angered. Later, under the cover of dusk, he cautiously approached the site. The massive log he had rigged was not just dislodged. It was shattered, splintered into pieces as if struck by lightning. The ground was torn up, bushes flattened, clear evidence of the werewolf's immense strength and fury. It had not been caught, but it had been delayed, angered, and it had left a clear sign. A deep, vicious set of claw marks gouged into a nearby pine tree, almost at Taza's eye level. It was a warning, a challenge. The creature knew it was being hunted. The game had escalated. Taza felt a grim sense of satisfaction mixed with a renewed surge of fear. His gambit was working, but he was also stirring a hornet's nest. The werewolf was not just a monster. It was an intelligent, vengeful adversary, and it would be coming for him with even greater fury now. The werewolf's furious response to his trap hardened Taza's resolve. The splintered log, the deep gouges in the pine tree, these were not just signs of rage, but also clues. The creature was powerful, yes, but it was also reactive, and it was leaving a trail, not just of destruction, but of its passage. He had to press his advantage, however slight it might seem. His arm still throbbed, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the beast's power. But he pushed the pain aside. He spent the next day following the signs of the werewolf's enraged departure from the sprung deadfall. The tracks were clearer now, driven deeper into the earth by the creature's fury. It was moving less cautiously, its anger overriding some of its cunning. Taza, however, moved with even greater stealth, keenly aware that the enraged beast was likely to be even more dangerous, more unpredictable. The trail led him into a part of the forest he rarely visited. A shadowed, brooding area where the trees grew unnaturally close together, their branches intertwining like gnarled fingers, blocking out much of the sunlight, even at midday. The air here was damp and cold, carrying a perpetual scent of decay and wet earth. It was a place the local deer and elk seemed to shun, a place where even the birdsong was muted and infrequent, a place, Taza realized with a growing sense of dread, that would make a perfect den for such a creature. As he pushed deeper into this gloomy labyrinth, the rank, musky scent of the werewolf grew stronger, almost overpowering. He found more signs of its presence, trees with bark stripped away by massive claws, bones of smaller animals scattered about, some gnawed, some simply shattered. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was tainted by the creature's malevolent aura. Finally, late in the afternoon, as the failing light cast long, distorted shadows, he found it. Tucked beneath a jumble of massive moss-covered boulders, at the base of a sheer cliff face, was a dark opening, the entrance to a cave. It was partially obscured by a curtain of tangled vines and overgrown bushes, but the well-worn path leading to it, and the overpowering stench emanating from within, left no doubt. This was the werewolf's lair. Taza's heart hammered against his ribs. He had found the beast's den, the heart of its territory. He crouched behind a thicket of thorny bushes, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. He could hear no sound from within, see no movement. Was the creature inside, resting, recovering from its wounds and its rage? Or was it out hunting, perhaps even hunting him? He remained hidden for what felt like an eternity, observing, listening. The silence from the cave was unnerving. He knew he could not simply charge in. That would be suicide. But he also knew he couldn't leave it be. This was his best chance to confront the creature on something other than its own terms, if he could somehow devise a plan. He began to meticulously study the terrain around the cave entrance. The ground sloped steeply downwards towards it. Above the entrance, the cliff face was sheer for some distance, but further up, it was broken by ledges and crevices. To one side, a dense thicket of rhododendrons offered potential cover. He noted the direction of the prevailing breeze, the position of the sun, every small detail that might be turned to his advantage. His mind raced, formulating a desperate plan. He would not try to enter the cave. Instead, he would try to lure the creature out into a kill zone he could prepare. He would use fire, perhaps, or a carefully orchestrated rock slide if he could find loose scree above. He needed to create an ambush, one that would give him a decisive advantage against the beast's superior strength and speed. He spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing, his movements slow and deliberate, his senses constantly on alert for any sign of the werewolf's return. He gathered dry tinder and firewood, placing it carefully in a position where, if lit, the smoke might drift towards the cave entrance. Scouted the cliff face above, searching for loose rocks, but found nothing substantial enough that he could dislodge easily or safely. The fire seemed his best option, not necessarily to harm the creature directly, but to flush it out, to create confusion and panic. As dusk settled, casting the gloomy forest in even deeper shadow, Taza positioned himself in the rhododendron thicket, his bow ready, his spear planted beside him. Had chosen a spot that offered a clear view of the cave entrance and several potential escape routes if things went wrong. He would wait until the moon was high, then light the fire. The waiting was a torment. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a distant twig sounded like the approach of the beast. The silence from the cave remained unbroken, a heavy, pregnant stillness that frayed his nerves. Was it even in there? Or had it somehow sensed his presence, his intentions, and was now circling around, preparing to turn his ambush into its own? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through him. He was acutely aware of his solitude, of the fact that he was one man, armed with primitive weapons against a supernatural horror. The moon climbed slowly, its cold light filtering through the dense canopy, creating a patchwork of silver and black. Seja took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. It was time. He reached for his fire-starting kit, his fingers fumbling slightly with the flint and steel. Just as he was about to strike a spark, a sound from within the cave made him freeze. A low growl, deeper and more resonant than any he had heard before. A sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It was followed by a scraping noise, the sound of something heavy dragging itself across stone. Seja's blood ran cold. The creature was in there, and it was stirring. But before he could react, before he could light his fire, a different sound reached his ears, a faint rustling from the dense woods behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Had the creature somehow circled him? Was his carefully planned ambush about to be turned on its head? The shadows behind him were deep, impenetrable. He strained his eyes, his ears, but could detect nothing more. He imagined it. Or was the werewolf not only cunning, but also capable of moving with a silence that defied its massive size? The horrifying possibility that he had walked into a trap of the beast's own making seized him. The hunter, he realized with a sickening lurch, might very well have become the hunted once more. The faint rustling behind him, a whisper of movement in the oppressive stillness, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Taza. Carefully constructed plan, his ambush seemed to crumble in an instant. The werewolf was not just a brute. It was a cunning hunter, perhaps even more attuned to this dark forest than he was. Had it sensed his presence all along? Had it deliberately allowed him to approach its lair, only to circle around and trap him? He abandoned his fire-starting kit, his spear now gripped tightly in his hand, his bow discarded as too slow for close-quarters combat, slowly backed away from the rhododendron thicket, pressing himself against the cool, damp rock face of the cliff, trying to make himself as small a target as possible. His eyes darted between the dark entrance of the cave in front of him and the impenetrable shadows of the woods to his rear, where he'd heard the sound. He was caught in a deadly pincer. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. From the cave entrance, the scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by another low, menacing growl. A massive, shadowy form began to emerge from the blackness of the lair. It was the werewolf, its eyes glowing with that same hellish red light, its silhouette even more terrifying in the dim, filtered moonlight. But as it took a step out of the cave, Taza's attention was violently wrenched away. The woods behind him, where he had heard the rustling, not one, but two smaller, though still formidable, wolf-like shapes burst from the undergrowth. They were not as monstrously large as the primary beast, but they were clearly of the same unnatural ilk, gaunt, with matted fur, glowing eyes, and an air of savage hunger. Pups or lesser members of a pack. The horrifying realization that he was not facing a solitary monster, but potentially a family or a small terrifying pack, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His ambush was not just compromised, it was a catastrophic failure. He had walked into their den, their territory, and they had closed the trap. The two smaller creatures, moving with incredible speed, fanned out, their growls low and menacing, clearly trying to flank him, to cut off any escape. The massive werewolf at the cave entrance let out a guttural roar, a sound of triumph and impending slaughter, and began to advance. Taza had only a split second to react. He knew he couldn't fight all three. His only chance, however slim, was to break through to escape the kill zone he himself had inadvertently created. He feinted towards the smaller creature on his left. Then, with a desperate surge of strength, he spun and charged directly at the one on his right, hoping to use the element of surprise to punch a hole in their tightening circle. He yelled, a primal warrior's cry, and thrust his spear. The smaller werewolf, surprised by his sudden aggression, tried to sidestep, but Taza's spear point grazed its flank, drawing a yelp of pain and a spray of dark blood. But the creature was quick. It recovered instantly, snapping at his leg, its teeth grazing his buckskin leggings. He didn't have time to press the advantage. The other smaller beast was already lunging for his exposed side. Taza twisted, using the shaft of his spear to deflect its snapping jaws. But its claws raked across his ribs, tearing through his buckskin shirt, sending fresh waves of fire through his body. And then the massive werewolf was upon them. It moved with a speed that belied its bulk, a terrifying black juggernaut. Taza saw a colossal clawed paw descending towards his head. He threw himself sideways, rolling, the blow glancing off his shoulder with stunning force, sending his spear clattering away into the darkness. He scrambled to his feet, disarmed, wounded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The three creatures were closing in, their red eyes burning with predatory hunger, their growls a chorus of impending doom. He was surrounded, outmatched, his carefully laid plans in ruins. He backed away, stumbling over roots and rocks, his eyes darting for any avenue of escape, but there was none. The cliff face was at his back, the three monstrous forms blocking any path forward. This was it. This was where his solitary journey would end. torn apart in the darkness by creatures from a nightmare. The massive werewolf let out a triumphant howl that seemed to shake the very trees. It took a slow, deliberate step towards him, savouring the moment. Taza could smell its fetid breath, see the saliva dripping from its razor-sharp teeth. In that moment of utter despair, as the beast lunged, a flicker of defiance, of pure animalistic survival instinct, surged through him. He ducked low, avoiding the snapping jaws, and with a desperate, almost blind surge of energy, he pushed himself off the cliff face, launching his body sideways, not towards escape, but into the dense, thorny tangle of the rhododendron thicket he had earlier considered for his ambush. Pain exploded through him as thorns tore at his skin, branches whipped across his face. But he pushed deeper, crawling, clawing his way through the suffocating vegetation. He could hear the enraged roars of the werewolves behind him, the sound of them crashing through the undergrowth in pursuit. He burst out of the far side of the thicket, gashed and bleeding from a dozen new wounds, his clothes torn, his body screaming in protest. He didn't look back. He ran. He ran with a desperation he had never known, fueled by terror and the primal urge to live. He could hear the beasts crashing through the forest behind him, their howls echoing through the night, closer than he liked. He stumbled, fell, picked himself up, and ran again, his lungs burning, his vision blurring. He had lost his spear, his primary weapon. He was bleeding from multiple wounds. His plan had failed spectacularly. He was alone, injured, and being hunted by a pack of horrors in the dead of night. The moon, now at its zenith, seemed to mock him with its cold, indifferent light. All truly seemed lost. Taza ran until his lungs burned like fire, and his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. The terrifying howls of the werewolf pack echoed behind him, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, a relentless soundtrack to his desperate flight. He crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over unseen roots, his body screaming in protest from his myriad wounds. The deep gashes from the massive werewolf's claws on his arm and ribs throbbed with a fiery pain, and fresh blood oozed from the countless scratches and tears inflicted by the thorny thicket and his desperate scramble through the forest. Finally, driven by sheer exhaustion and the dawning realization that he couldn't outrun them indefinitely in his wounded state, he spotted a narrow crevice between two massive moss-covered boulders, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. With his last reserves of strength, he wedged himself deep into the tight space, collapsing onto the cold, damp earth, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He lay there, trembling, listening to the sounds of the pursuit. The howls and crashing noises grew closer, then seemed to pass by his hiding spot, eventually fading into the distance as the pack continued its search elsewhere. For a long time, Taza didn't move, every muscle aching, his mind a whirlwind of terror and despair. He was trapped, injured, disarmed, and alone. His spear, his most trusted weapon, was gone, lost in the chaotic fight near the cave. His wickiup was no longer safe. His meticulously planned ambush had not only failed, but had revealed an even greater threat. Not one monster, but several. The forest, his lifelong sanctuary, had become a hunting ground, and he was the prey. A cold wave of hopelessness washed over him. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps it was simply his fate to die here, torn apart by creatures that should not exist, his bones left to bleach in the uncaring wilderness. What chance did one man, however skilled, have against such supernatural power, such relentless malice? He thought of his ancestors, of the hardships they had faced, and a bitter shame filled him. He had failed. He had let this darkness invade his world, and now it was consuming him. Fever began to set in, a product of his wounds and exhaustion. He shivered uncontrollably, though the night was not particularly cold. His thoughts grew hazy, fragmented. Images flashed through his mind, the glowing red eyes of the werewolves, the glint of their terrible teeth, the feeling of their claws tearing his flesh. He closed his eyes, a weary sigh escaping his lips. Perhaps it was better to just give in, to let the darkness take him. But then, deep within the fog of his pain and despair, something stirred. A tiny ember, almost extinguished, flickered faintly. It was the Andes spirit, the unyielding core of resilience that had been passed down through generations of his people. They had faced starvation, drought, enemies, and loss, yet they had endured. They had adapted. They had fought. His grandmother's face appeared in his mind's eye, her wise, knowing gaze. He remembered her words, not just about herbs and protection, but about the strength of the spirit, the fire within the soul that no darkness could truly quench unless one allowed it. He thought of the land, this forest that was a part of him, a part of his very being. Was he to simply surrender it to these abominations? Was he to let them defile it? To let their unnatural presence taint it forever? A spark of anger, of defiance, ignited within him, pushing back against the encroaching despair. No, he would not. He might die, yes, but he would not die cowering in a hole like a frightened rabbit. If he was to fall, he would fall fighting, as a warrior of the Unde should. With a groan, he pushed himself into a sitting position, the movement sending jolts of agony through his battered body. He assessed his wounds in the dim light, filtering into the crevice. They were bad, but perhaps not immediately life-threatening if he could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. He tore more strips from his tattered leggings, clumsily binding the worst of the gashes. His mind, clearer now, began to work. He had no spear, but he was not entirely weaponless. He still had his knife, its keen edge a small comfort. And he had his knowledge. He strained to remember the specific plants his grandmother had used for wounds, for fever. He recalled a certain type of moss, one that grew on the north side of trees, that she had used to pack wounds to stop bleeding, and the bitter root, the one he had found only a small piece of before. If he could find more, it was said to fight infection and ward off evil. He knew he couldn't stay in the crevice for long. The werewolves might circle back. He needed a more defensible position, and he needed to rearm himself, however crudely. Driven by this newfound, desperate resolve, Taza waited until the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Then, cautiously, painfully, he eased himself out of the crevice. The forest was quiet, deceptively peaceful. He moved slowly, every step an effort, his eyes scanning for any sign of the beasts, his ears straining for the slightest sound. He found a patch of the moss he remembered, and carefully applied it to his deepest wounds. He searched for the bitter root, his eyes scanning the forest floor, and to his immense relief, he found a larger cluster of it, growing near the base of an ancient oak. He chewed a small piece, its acrid taste filling his mouth, and tucked the rest away. His immediate survival attended to, his mind turned to weapons. He needed something with reach, something to replace his lost spear. He scanned the surrounding trees, his gaze falling on a young straight sapling, perhaps as thick as his wrist. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. Using his knife, he painstakingly began to cut it down, then to sharpen one end into a crude point. He built a small smokeless fire using his flint and steel, and carefully hardened the tip in the embers, just as his ancestors had done for millennia. It was a poor substitute for his finely crafted spear, but it was something. A weapon, a symbol of his refusal to surrender. As he worked, a desperate plan began to form in his mind, a plan born of utter necessity and the dawning realization that he could not simply hide or flee. He had to confront them, to end this, one way or another. He thought of the terrain, of the werewolves' numbers and their ferocity. He needed an equalizer. And then he remembered the narrow gorge, a place where the river cut deep between sheer rock walls, not far from his old wickiup. A place where their numbers would count for less, where he might be able to face them on more even terms, or at least channel their attack. A grim determination settled over Taza. He was wounded, outmatched, armed with little more than a sharpened stick and his own indomitable will. But the fire within his soul, once a mere ember, was now burning with a fierce, defiant light. He would not wait for the beasts to find him. This time he would choose the battleground. He would make his stand. The journey to the narrow gorge was an agonizing trek. Every step sent jolts of pain through Taza's wounded body. But the fire of his resolve burned hotter than any physical discomfort. He moved with a grim purpose, his makeshift spear clutched tightly in his hand, his keen knife secure at his hip. He forced himself to eat some of the bitter root, hoping its reputed properties would hold back infection, and perhaps lend him some measure of spiritual strength. The sun climbed high, then began its descent, and still he pushed onward, driven by a singular, desperate thought. This had to end. He reached the gorge as the late afternoon sun began to cast long, deepening shadows. It was as he remembered, a narrow chasm, perhaps only a few man-lengths wide at its tightest point, with sheer rock walls rising high on either side. The river, diminished by the dry season, gurgled far below over smooth stones. This was the place. Here their numbers would mean less. Here he could face them, perhaps one at a time if he was cunning. Taza didn't have much time to prepare. He knew the werewolves, with their keen senses, would eventually pick up his trail. He scanned the area, his mind racing. He needed to use every element of this terrain to his advantage. He noticed a precarious overhang of loose rocks and scree on one side of the gorge, not directly above the narrowest point, but close enough that a significant disturbance might send it cascading down. An idea, risky and uncertain, began to form. He spent what little time he had shoring up his position at the narrowest point of the gorge, creating a small defensible space with a few strategically placed boulders he could barely move. He needed to ensure his footing was secure. Then he turned his attention to the overhang. Using his makeshift spear, he began to carefully prod and pry at the base of the loosest section of rock, working with a desperate urgency, praying he wouldn't dislodge it prematurely. He managed to loosen it significantly, so that a strong impact or vibration nearby might be enough to bring it down. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, he heard it. a distant howl, then another, closer this time. They had found his trail. They were coming. Taza took his position in the narrowest part of the gorge, his back against the cold rock wall, his makeshift spear held ready. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the approaching howls. This was it. There would be no retreat, no escape, victory or death. The first of the werewolves appeared at the entrance to the gorge, one of the smaller, gaunter ones he had faced at the lair. It paused, its red eyes glowing in the dim light, sniffing the air, its head low, a menacing growl rumbling in its chest. It saw Taza and launched itself forward, a blur of dark fur and snapping teeth. Taza met the charge with a warrior's yell. He thrust his fire-hardened spear, not at the creature's head or chest, but aiming lower, for its leg, hoping to cripple it, to slow it down. The sharpened wood bit deep into the werewolf's thigh. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony and fury, and stumbled, its charge broken. Taza didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the fading light, and plunged it deep into the beast's exposed throat. Dark, fetid blood gushed forth. The creature thrashed, then collapsed, its glowing eyes dimming, one down. But there was no time for relief. The second, smaller werewolf was already bounding into the gorge, its howls echoing off the rock walls. It had seen its packmate fall, and its fury was terrifying. It lunged faster than the first, its claws extended. Taza sidestepped, the claws tearing through the air where he had stood a moment before. He thrust his spear again, but the creature was too quick, deflecting the blow with its forearm. They circled each other in the narrow confines, a deadly dance of predator and prey. Taza, weaker, wounded, relied on his agility and his desperate courage. He feinted, then drove the butt of his spear into the creature's snout. It yelped, momentarily stunned, and in that instant Taza lunged again with his knife. This time he found its heart. The beast shuddered and fell, two down, but the greatest threat remained. A deafening roar announced the arrival of the alpha, the massive werewolf that had nearly killed him at the lair. It filled the entrance to the gorge, its sheer size monstrous, its red eyes burning with an incandescent rage as it saw its fallen packmates. It let out a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the rock walls, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was the true test. Taza knew his makeshift spear and knife would be of little avail against this behemoth in a direct confrontation. He had to rely on his desperate plan. The massive werewolf charged, its speed terrifying in the narrow space. Taza stood his ground until the last possible second. Then, with a desperate yell, he slammed the butt of his spear with all his might against the rock wall, directly beneath the loosened overhang he had prepared. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The werewolf was almost upon him, its massive jaws snapping, its hot breath fetid on his face. Taza braced for the impact, for the tearing claws, the crushing teeth. Then, with a low rumble, then a deafening crack, the overhang gave way. A torrent of rocks, scree and dust cascaded down into the gorge, not directly onto Taza, but just in front of him, directly in the path of the charging werewolf. The massive beast, caught by surprise, tried to halt its charge, but its momentum was too great. It skidded, roaring in fury and perhaps fear, as the tons of rock and debris slammed into it, burying its lower body, pinning it against the opposite wall of the gorge. A cloud of dust filled the narrow passage, choking Taza, blinding him momentarily. When the dust began to settle, Tarzan saw the werewolf, trapped, roaring in agony and impotent rage, its upper body still free, its massive arms clawing at the rocks that imprisoned it. It was wounded, pinned, but still terrifyingly alive, its red eyes fixed on Tarzan with an unholy malevolence. This was his chance, his only chance. Ignoring the screaming pain in his own body, Tarzan scrambled over the fallen rocks towards the trapped monster. The werewolf snapped and lunged, its reach still formidable, but its movements were hampered. Tarzan dodged a sweeping claw. Then, with a final desperate surge of adrenaline, he plunged his fire-hardened spear, all that remained of his weaponry, with all his strength, into one of the creature's glowing red eyes. The werewolf let out a sound that was not a roar, not a howl, but a single piercing shriek of unimaginable agony that seemed to tear through the twilight air. Its massive body convulsed, its remaining eye wide with shock and pain. It thrashed against the rocks. Then, with a final shuddering groan, it went still. Tarzan stood panting, covered in dust and blood, his own and the creature's, his makeshift spear still embedded in the monster's skull. Silence, profound and absolute, descended upon the gorge, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the distant gurgle of the river below. He had done it. Against all odds, wounded and outmatched, he had faced the nightmare. He had fought, and he had won. The final hunt was over. For a long time, Tarzan stood there in the narrow gorge, leaning heavily against the cold rock wall, the dust settling around him like a grim shroud. His makeshift spear remained embedded in the massive werewolf's skull, a gruesome testament to the life-or-death struggle. The silence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the cacophony of roars, shrieks, and crashing rocks that had filled the chasm moments before. It was the silence of cessation, the silence of an unnatural threat finally extinguished. His body screamed with pain. Every muscle ached, every wound throbbed. Exhaustion, deep and profound, threatened to pull him under. He looked at the still forms of the three werewolves, their monstrous shapes almost unreal in the fading light. A tremor ran through him, not of fear this time, but of the sheer, brutal reality of what he had endured, what he had done. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself away from the wall. He retrieved his knife, wiping its blade on a patch of relatively clean buckskin. He approached the massive, pinned werewolf, and with a grimace worked his spear free. It was battered, the fire-hardened tip splintered, but it had served its purpose. As true darkness began to settle, Tarzan knew he couldn't stay in the gorge, this charnel house of his own making. He needed to get away, to find a place to rest, to tend to his wounds properly. With painstaking effort, he began to climb out of the narrow chasm, avoiding the treacherous scree of the rock slide. Each movement was an agony, but the knowledge that the immediate threat was gone, that the red eyes would not be hunting him in the night, lent him a desperate strength. He found a small, sheltered alcove not far from the gorge, hidden amongst a cluster of ancient junipers. Here he collapsed, his energy utterly spent. But even in his exhaustion, instinct took over. He carefully cleaned his wounds as best he could with the last of his water and more of the healing moss he had gathered. He chewed another piece of the bitter root, its acrid taste a small price for its potential benefits. Sleep, when it finally came, was heavy and dreamless, the sleep of a body and mind pushed beyond their limits. When Taza awoke, the sun was already high, filtering through the juniper branches, its warmth a welcome sensation on his battered skin. For a moment he lay still, disoriented, the events of the previous day feeling like a fevered nightmare. Then, the dull ache in his wounds, the stiffness in his limbs, brought it all rushing back. It had been real. He sat up slowly, wincing. The forest around him was alive with sound. Birdsong, the chirping of insects, the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the normal, everyday chorus of the wilderness, a sound he hadn't truly heard, hadn't truly appreciated in days. It was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, and now, with the unnatural presence vanquished, it could finally exhale. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the woods, the palpable sense of menace, was gone. Over the next few days, Taza focused on healing. He found a clean spring, far from the defiled one, and drank deeply. He hunted small game when his strength allowed, his movements still stiff and painful, but improving each day. He found more of the bitter root and other healing herbs his grandmother had taught him about, applying poultices to his wounds, drinking infusions to ward off fever. He did not return to the gorge. There was no need. He knew what lay there, and he preferred to let nature reclaim it. As his body mended, so too did his spirit. The terror of the hunt began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of awe at what he had survived, and a profound, bone-deep understanding of the thin veil between the known world and the mysteries that lay beyond. He had faced an evil that defied explanation, a creature from the darkest corners of myth, and he had endured. His solitude, once a simple preference, now felt different. It was no longer just a state of being, but something earned, something tested in the crucible of unimaginable horror and reaffirmed. He had fought alone, and in that aloneness, he had found a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Weeks later, when his wounds had mostly healed, leaving behind a tapestry of new scars that told their own silent story, Taza returned to the site of his old wickiup. It was damaged, as he had left it after the werewolf's first direct attack, but it was repairable. He began the slow process of rebuilding, his movements once again imbued with their familiar grace, though perhaps now a little more deliberate, a little more thoughtful. He continued his journey of living alone in the forest. He hunted, he gathered, he moved through the wilderness like a whisper, his connection to the land deeper, more resonant than ever before. The forest was still his sanctuary, his provider, but now it held a new layer of meaning for him. It was a place where he had faced the ultimate trial, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. He never spoke of the werewolves to anyone, for there was no one to speak to in his chosen solitude. But sometimes, on nights when the moon was full, and its cold light bathed the forest in silver, he would pause in his activities, his gaze drifting towards the distant shadowed peaks near the gorge. He would touch the scars on his arm, on his ribs, a silent acknowledgement of the darkness he had faced, the battle he had won. The forest breathed again, and so did Taza, its solitary guardian. His spirit, like the ancient pines around him, stood tall, weathered but unbowed, forever marked by the shadow of the hungry moon and the echo of a final, victorious hunt.